Everyone laughed at him when he inherited an old hut, certain that there was nothing of value there. But as soon as they stepped inside, their smiles disappeared and their faces showed shock. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The morning air in the small southern town carried a kind of stillness that felt heavier than usual. The sun was warm but not yet harsh, and the breeze carried with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass from the cemetery across the street. Michael Hudson stepped out of his old weathered pickup truck, his black dress shoes crunching over the loose gravel of the church parking lot. His suit, though simple and a bit worn at the cuffs, was freshly pressed. He had shaved that morning, his jawline sharp and his eyes held a tired, guarded expression. This was not a day for showing too much emotion in public. Family members were already gathering near the steps of the Baptist church, their voices low, their movements slow. Some nodded politely when they saw him, but others avoided his gaze entirely, their eyes sliding past him as if he were just another face in the crowd. There was history there, years of quiet tension and unspoken judgment. Michael knew it well and had long since stopped trying to explain himself to people who only called when they wanted something. The church was small, white-painted with peeling trim, and the worn wooden doors groaned faintly when opened. Inside, the air smelled of polished pews, old hymnals, and the faint perfume of the church ladies who had been preparing for the service. At the front of the sanctuary, beneath a simple wooden cross, stood the casket of Henry Hudson, Michael's grandfather. Henry had been the kind of man people remembered in two ways, with respect or with bitterness. Respect because he had been hard-working, unflinchingly honest, and stubborn in the way men who had lived through harder times often were. Bitterness because his standards were high and he didn't make exceptions for laziness or greed, not even for his own children. Michael had grown up under those standards and had learned early that his grandfather's approval had to be earned, not given. The service began quietly, the low murmur of conversation fading as the pastor took his place at the pulpit. His voice was warm and deliberate as he spoke of Henry's long life, his service in the community, his faith, and the family he left behind. Michael listened, but the words drifted in and out of focus, his mind wandering back to summers spent in his grandfather's yard, the smell of fresh-cut wood, and the sound of Henry's deep voice telling him which boards were strong enough to use and which to toss aside. He remembered sitting on the back porch as a boy, watching the sun go down while Henry whittled at a piece of cedar, the shavings curling onto the dusty floorboards. His grandfather didn't speak much unless he had something worth saying, and Michael had learned to pay attention when he did. Those memories were the kind that settled deep inside a person, shaping the way they thought about loyalty, work, and the kind of man they wanted to be. When the service ended, the family gathered outside in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones. Some wept openly, while others were already checking their watches, thinking ahead to the reading of the will. Michael overheard bits of conversation, names of assets, mentions of the house in town, and the large piece of farmland Henry still owned. No one mentioned him directly, but he felt their eyes on him now and then, as though they were measuring what he might be hoping to get. The reading was scheduled for later that afternoon, and the family made their way to the old law office on Main Street. The building was as much a part of the town as the courthouse, its brick walls faded by decades of sun and rain. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and the tick of a wall clock was the only sound until the creak of chairs filled the room as everyone took their places around a long oak table. The attorney, Mr. Whitaker, was an older man with neatly combed white hair and glasses that sat low on his nose. He cleared his throat, adjusted his papers, and began reading in a calm, steady voice. The early portions of the will were straightforward. Henry's 2 surviving sisters each received a share of the farmland and the old Buick he had kept in the garage for years. His 3 children, Michael's father having passed away some years before, were each to receive $500,000 in cash from various accounts and investments. The mood in the room was one of quiet satisfaction for most. There were faint smiles, the kind that people tried to hide but couldn't. Each beneficiary nodded as their portion was read, already imagining what they would do with it. Michael sat still, his hands folded loosely in his lap, not expecting much. He had never once heard his grandfather talk about leaving him anything of significant value, though he also knew that Henry had trusted him in ways he never trusted the rest of the family. When Mr. Whitaker finally reached his name, there was a small pause before he read aloud. To my grandson, Michael Hudson, I leave the property located at the northern edge of Hawthorne Forest, commonly referred to in the family as the cabin. The land, the structure, and all that is within it are his to keep, to use, or to dispose of as he sees fit. A ripple of amusement passed through the room. Someone stifled a chuckle, another muttered something under their breath. Michael didn't need to hear the words to know their meaning. The cabin had been dismissed by the family years ago as worthless, a relic from a time when Henry had spent more of his weekends hunting and fishing than in town. Overgrown, aging, and far from any main road, it was seen as nothing more than a burden. The will was concluded, and the legal formalities quickly wrapped up. Relatives began to gather their belongings, their conversations shifting to bank accounts, repairs to their new properties, and vacations they might now afford. Michael rose quietly from his chair and thanked Mr. Whitaker before stepping outside. The late afternoon sun was low, casting long shadows across the street. Standing beside his truck, Michael took a slow breath. The others could laugh if they wanted. He knew his grandfather, and he knew the man never made decisions without a reason. That cabin, though dismissed as a decaying piece of timber in the woods, had been left to him deliberately. There was a story behind it, of that he was certain. And if he wanted to understand his grandfather's final message to him, he would have to see it for himself. Without waiting for the weekend or for the whispers to die down, Michael decided he would go there. Soon. And with that decision came the faintest trace of anticipation, something he hadn't felt all day. The decision to go to the cabin took root in Michael's mind and grew stronger with each passing hour. By the time he woke the next morning, it was no longer a question of if, but when. He gathered a few essentials, a change of clothes, a flashlight, some tools, and the worn leather gloves he had once used when working alongside his grandfather, and loaded them into the bed of his old pickup. The air was cooler than the day before, with a pale gray sky hanging low, as if the forest itself had called for cloud cover to welcome him back. The road out of town wound slowly toward the hills, where the trees began to close in on either side like a green corridor. Asphalt gave way to a patchy strip of gravel, and the hum of tires was replaced by the crunch and rattle of loose stone. The further he drove, the more the world seemed to retreat behind him. Houses became scarce, then disappeared altogether, replaced by thick clusters of pine and oak. The air grew richer with the scent of moss and damp earth. A fox darted across the road, its red coat a sudden flash against the muted colors of the undergrowth. He crossed an old wooden bridge, its planks groaning under the weight of the truck. Beneath it, a narrow creek wound its way through the valley, its water dark and slow-moving after recent rains. A mile later, he passed the crumbling remains of a roadside gas station, its pumps rusted and its sign barely legible through years of neglect. These landmarks felt almost like gatekeepers to the past, reminders that he was driving toward a place untouched by the pace of the modern world. The road narrowed further until it was little more than a single-lane path, bordered by tall grass that brushed against the sides of the truck. Finally, the trees opened slightly, revealing the cabin. It stood at the edge of a small clearing, its weathered boards darkened by time and exposure. The roof sagged slightly near the center, and the porch leaned just enough to suggest that one day soon it would need new supports. The front steps were worn smooth in the middle, a testament to decades of use. Michael cut the engine and sat for a moment, just taking it in. This was not the kind of property that would impress the family members who had laughed at his inheritance, but to him there was something honest about it. It was a place built for living simply, for working with your hands, for finding comfort in the essentials. He stepped out of the truck, the air cooler here, filled with the smell of pine needles and distant rain. The grass in the yard had grown waist-high in places, and wildflowers bloomed in uneven clusters, adding color to the otherwise subdued palette of weathered wood and green forest. As he walked toward the porch, the boards beneath his boots gave a long, low creak. He put his hand on the railing and felt the rough texture of the wood beneath his palm, splinters catching at his glove. The front door was heavy, its paint almost entirely worn away, revealing the grain beneath. It resisted at first when he turned the knob, but with a firm push it gave way, swinging inward on hinges that complained with a metallic groan. Inside, the air was still, carrying the faint scent of cedar and something else, an earthy undertone that spoke of years without regular use. Dust lay in a thin layer over the furniture, which was sparse but solid, a long wooden dining table with mismatched chairs, a narrow sideboard, and a pair of armchairs near the stone fireplace. The fireplace itself was impressive in its simplicity, built from large, uneven stones held together with mortar that had aged to a pale, weathered gray. A cast-iron kettle hung on a hook inside, and above the mantel sat a row of framed photographs, their images faded by time. He moved slowly through the main room, his footsteps muffled on the worn floorboards. The walls were paneled in dark wood, the grain still visible beneath the varnish, and small windows let in narrow beams of light that revealed swirling motes of dust. A tall bookcase stood in one corner, half filled with books whose spines bore the wear of repeated readings. Many were about history, farming, and old trades, a reflection of the man who had once lived here. Michael made his way into the small kitchen, where a wood-burning stove stood beside a porcelain sink. The counters were bare except for a single enamel coffee pot and a chipped mug resting upside down beside it. Everything was neat, almost deliberately so, as if the last person to leave had taken care to preserve the order of the space. He could almost picture his grandfather moving through the rooms, putting things away, closing cupboards, and checking the lock on the door before heading out. A short hallway led to a bedroom furnished with a simple bed frame, a chest of drawers, and a narrow wardrobe. The bed was made, the blanket folded with precision, the pillow centered just so. In the wardrobe hung a single old coat, heavy and worn, its fabric carrying the faintest trace of pipe smoke when he lifted it from its hanger. The sight stirred something in him, memories of cold mornings when his grandfather had pulled on that coat before heading out to split wood or check on the traps he sometimes set along the creek. Michael returned to the main room and stood before the fireplace, letting his eyes roam over the photographs on the mantel. One showed Henry as a young man, holding up a large fish beside a lake he didn't recognize. Another captured a group of men in work clothes, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a half-built barn. And there was one of Henry with a much younger Michael, the two of them sitting on the porch steps, the boy holding a hammer almost too big for his small hands. The sight of it brought an unexpected tightness to his throat. The day had slipped toward evening without his noticing, and the cabin's interior had grown dim. He found a box of matches in a drawer and lit the oil lamp on the table, the flame casting a warm, flickering light over the room. He decided, then, that he would spend the night here. The thought of returning to town didn't appeal to him. This place felt removed from the noise and petty concerns of the rest of the family. Here there was only quiet and the steady presence of the forest outside. He unpacked the few things he had brought, placing them neatly on the table, then set about making a small fire in the hearth. The woodpile outside was covered with a sheet of cracked tarp, but the logs beneath were dry enough to catch easily. Soon the fire was burning steadily, filling the cabin with warmth and the familiar scent of smoke. He sat in one of the armchairs, stretching his legs toward the heat, and listened to the crackle of the flames. For a while, he allowed himself to simply be there without thinking about what might come next. But as the firelight flickered over the floorboards, his gaze drifted toward the far corner of the room where a rug lay slightly askew. Something about it caught his attention. Perhaps the way its edges didn't sit flush against the floor, as though it had been moved and not quite put back. He filed the thought away for the morning, telling himself that there would be time enough to explore further in the light of day. As night settled fully over the clearing, Michael lay down on the bed in the small bedroom, the blankets pulled up to his chin. The silence outside was deep, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the faint creak of the cabin settling. In that stillness, he felt the distance from town more keenly, but instead of unease, there was a sense of being exactly where he was meant to be. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered if this place held the reason his grandfather had chosen him above all others. When sleep finally came, it was heavy and dreamless, the kind that left a man feeling as though he had been dropped into another world entirely. And in the morning, he would begin to see that the cabin had its own stories to tell, stories hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for the right hands to uncover them. Morning came slowly in the forest, the pale light filtering through the small cabin windows in narrow, golden beams that illuminated the dust suspended in the still air. Michael stirred in bed, the weight of the quilt heavy over him and the faint smell of wood smoke lingering from the fire he had built the night before. The quiet was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the old timbers as they shifted with the morning chill. He lay there for a while, letting his senses adjust before swinging his legs over the side of the bed and pulling on his boots. The floorboards were cool underfoot, and the air inside was crisp, urging him to stoke the fire again before the cabin grew too cold. In the main room, the embers in the hearth were still faintly glowing. He added a couple of logs from the pile by the door, crouching to watch as the flames caught and began to spread, sending a soft warmth back into the space. There was no rush in his movements. Out here, time felt different, as though the world had slowed its pace to match the measured rhythm of the forest. He brewed coffee on the wood stove, using the old enamel pot he had found in the kitchen, and sat at the table sipping it slowly, gazing out through the dusty glass at the trees swaying gently in the breeze. It was only after he had finished his coffee and set about tidying the place that his thoughts returned to the odd detail he had noticed the night before, The rug in the far corner of the main room lying just slightly out of place. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, chalking it up to the cabin's age or perhaps a memory of his grandfather moving it for some forgotten reason. But now, in the daylight, it caught his attention again. Something about the way it sat against the floor didn't seem right. He crossed the room, his boots thudding softly on the planks, and stood over the rug. It was thick and heavy, woven in a faded geometric pattern that might once have been bright, but had dulled to muted reds and browns with time. He crouched down, running a hand over it, feeling the coarse texture beneath his fingers. When he lifted one edge, dust puffed up into the air, but there was something else, an unmistakable draft, cool and dry, rising from beneath. Curiosity sharpened in him, and he pulled the rug back further, revealing a section of floor that looked different from the rest. The boards here were narrower, set more tightly together, and in the center was a rectangular outline, almost flush with the floor but just distinct enough to see. A metal ring, tarnished with age, was set into one end. It wasn't part of the cabin's ordinary construction. This was a hatch. Michael sat back on his heels, the realization settling over him with a weight that was both thrilling and unsettling. His grandfather had never mentioned anything about a storage space or cellar beneath the cabin, but here it was, plain as day. The ring was stiff when he first tried to lift it, the metal cold and unyielding, but with a firmer pull it gave way, the wood groaning softly as the hatch began to open. Beneath was darkness, thick, complete, and waiting. He let the hatch rest open and glanced around the room, searching for a light. His eyes fell on the old writing desk tucked against the far wall, its drawers slightly ajar. He opened the top drawer and began rummaging through its contents. Bundles of yellowed envelopes tied with string, a pocket knife, a small tin of nails, and, near the back, a key. The key was small, brass, and cool to the touch, its teeth worn from use. He didn't know what it opened until he spotted a padlock fixed to a narrow latch inside the hatch's frame. With a click, the lock yielded, and Michael swung the latch aside, pulling the hatch up fully now. The smell that rose from below was not unpleasant. It was dry, with a faint scent of old wood and something metallic, like coins or tools that had been stored away for decades. A set of wooden steps descended into the darkness, the edges of each tread worn smooth. He fetched the flashlight from his bag, the beam cut in a clean line through the shadows, and began to descend slowly, one hand on the wall for balance. The air grew cooler as he went down, and the silence deepened until he could hear only his own breathing. At the bottom of the steps, the light revealed a compact space, the walls and floor constructed from fitted stone, as though someone had built a small chamber beneath the cabin with care and skill. The ceiling was low enough that he had to stoop slightly, and the corners were free from cobwebs or debris, which struck him as strange for a place so obviously hidden and unused. Against one wall stood a series of wooden crates stacked neatly, their surfaces coated with a thin layer of dust. Along another wall, shelves had been built from thick planks, each holding objects that caught the light in muted glints. He stepped closer, angling the flashlight to see more clearly. The shelves held metal boxes, old tin containers, and, on the highest shelf, what looked like a leather-bound book. Michael felt a quiet excitement rising in him, the kind that comes when you're on the edge of discovering something important. He set the flashlight on a shelf so its beam spilled across the room, then reached for one of the smaller crates. It was heavy, but the lid came off with a bit of effort, revealing a cloth bundle inside. Unwrapping it, he found rows of coins, each in its own protective sleeve, the designs intricate and the metal gleaming even in the dim light. They were from different eras, some clearly old enough to be of significant historical value. His pulse quickened. He replaced the bundle carefully and turned to the leather-bound book, lifting it down from the shelf. It was heavier than it looked, the cover cracked but the spine still strong. When he opened it, the pages were filled with his grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, precise, deliberate, and clean. Each page described an item in detail, listing where it had come from, the date it had been acquired, and sometimes a short note about its history or meaning. It was more than a record. It was a chronicle of a lifetime's passion. Michael closed the book gently, a deep respect settling over him. This was no ordinary collection. It had been built with care, preserved with intention, and hidden away where only someone truly trusted would find it. He thought of the moment in the lawyer's office when the others had laughed at his inheritance. They had seen only a cabin in the woods, a place they wouldn't have taken even for free. But here, beneath its floor, was something they couldn't begin to imagine. As he stood there, the light of the flashlight casting long shadows against the stone walls, he began to understand that his grandfather had left him far more than a piece of property. He had left him a responsibility. And whatever else was hidden in this place, Michael knew it was meant for him alone to discover. The air in the hidden chamber seemed to settle more heavily around Michael as he stood in the stillness, the beam of the flashlight drifting over the carefully arranged shelves and crates. The place was not what he had imagined when he first realized there was a hatch beneath the cabin floor. He had expected dust, cobwebs, perhaps some long-forgotten tools or jars of preserved food from decades past. Instead, it was like stepping into a private museum, a vault constructed by someone who valued not just the security of his possessions, but the dignity of how they were kept. The stones of the walls were smooth to the touch, laid so tightly together that not even a sliver of light could seep through. It was cool here, the kind of coolness that came not from dampness but from a constant, measured temperature, perfect for preservation. He moved towards the shelves again, setting the flashlight so it illuminated more of the room. Along one wall, wooden cabinets with small brass handles stood in an orderly line. The brass had dulled over the years, but the wood was polished to a low sheen, as though someone had wiped it down regularly, even in the absence of visitors. Michael pulled open one of the drawers, expecting perhaps papers or ordinary keepsakes, but what he found made him pause. Inside were coins, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows within velvet-lined compartments. Some bore dates from the early 1800s, their surfaces rich with patina, while others looked almost new, their edges sharp and designs crisp. He lifted one gently, feeling its weight in his palm, tracing the delicate engravings that marked it as foreign currency from a country he didn't immediately recognize. Replacing it with care, he turned his attention to another cabinet. This one held a different sort of treasure. Medals, each mounted within a small frame or resting in a cushioned box. Military honors from various eras lay alongside commemorative pieces minted for historical events, each accompanied by a handwritten tag in his grandfather's meticulous script. There was a story behind each one. He knew it instinctively, and those stories were likely preserved somewhere in the thick, leather-bound book he had already found. The table in the center of the room drew him next. It was sturdy, built from dark wood, and upon it lay several objects that seemed to have been left mid-study: a magnifying glass, a pair of cotton gloves, and a small jeweler's lamp sat neatly beside an open box containing several gold coins. He imagined his grandfather here, the lamp casting a warm circle of light over his work as he inspected each piece, perhaps humming softly to himself or pausing to jot down a note in the record book. The thought carried with it an intimacy that was both comforting and strange. It was like intruding on a private ritual, yet it felt somehow permitted, even invited. On the far side of the room, a set of narrow shelves reached nearly to the ceiling, filled with smaller containers, some metal, some wooden, all sealed. He selected one at random, its surface cool and smooth beneath his fingers, and lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of banknotes, each one preserved in a protective sleeve. They were from different eras and nations, the designs intricate and the paper crisp despite their age. The colors ranged from muted sepias to vibrant blues and greens, and the notes bore portraits of figures Michael didn't recognize, as well as elaborate flourishes that spoke of a time when currency was as much an art form as it was a tool of trade. As he explored, a sense of the room's purpose began to form in his mind. This was more than storage. It was a sanctuary for history, a place where objects of value were not hoarded for their worth alone, but cherished for the stories they carried. Every coin, every medal, every note had been placed here deliberately, protected from the erosion of time and the grasp of careless hands. Michael's gaze returned to the leather-bound book he had carried down from the shelf. He opened it again, thumbing through the pages with a reverence he rarely felt for any inanimate object. Each entry was precise, documenting not just the physical description of an item, but the circumstances under which it had been acquired. Some had been purchased at auctions or from fellow collectors. Others had been gifts exchanged between friends who shared his grandfather's passion. A few entries hinted at adventures, trips to distant towns, conversations with old veterans who parted with their medals only after long talks over coffee. Reading these entries, Michael could almost hear his grandfather's voice. It was in the choice of words, the steady hand of the pen, the way the facts were laid out without embellishment yet carried the weight of something deeply personal. He realized that this book was as much a memoir as it was a catalog, a testament to a lifetime spent in pursuit of something beyond material wealth. The quiet of the underground room seemed to deepen as he read, broken only by the occasional creak of the old steps above when the cabin settled. He imagined how many years this place had remained undisturbed, its secrets known only to one man until now. The thought carried with it a strange gravity. He was no longer just a curious grandson poking around in an inherited property. He was now the keeper of something rare, something that had been entrusted to him with purpose. Closing the book gently, he placed it back on the table and stood for a long moment, letting his eyes travel over the room once more. The idea of cataloging it all himself took root in his mind, not as a task to be completed quickly, but as a long-term devotion, a way to honor the work that had been done here. He could already envision coming back regularly, learning more about each piece, and perhaps even adding to the collection in his own way. When he finally made his way back to the stairs, flashlight in hand, he paused at the bottom step and looked back over his shoulder. The beam of light fell across the cabinets and shelves, the shadows stretching long in the stillness. There was no doubt in his mind now that the cabin had never been a mere afterthought in the will. His grandfather had chosen this place and him for a reason. Whatever those reasons were, Michael intended to uncover them fully, one discovery at a time. He climbed the steps slowly, each footfall bringing him closer to the hatch above and the ordinary world of the cabin's main room. Yet, he knew that from now on, nothing about this place would feel entirely ordinary again. The knowledge of what lay beneath his feet had changed it, had changed him. As he closed the hatch gently and pulled the rug back into place, the forest light slanted in through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room. Somewhere in that quiet, he felt the first stirrings of a responsibility he was only beginning to understand. A responsibility to protect, to preserve, and to live up to the trust his grandfather had placed in him. When he sat down in the armchair by the fireplace, the book resting on his knees, he knew the next step would come soon enough. Somewhere among these treasures lay more than history. There were answers, and perhaps even messages meant only for him. And he was ready to listen. The fire in the cabin had burned low, leaving only a faint bed of embers and the occasional pop of settling wood. Michael sat in the armchair, the weight of the leather-bound book on his lap, his thoughts still anchored in the underground room. The discovery had left him both exhilarated and unsettled, a curious mix of pride and responsibility pressing in from all sides. He couldn't shake the sense that the collection, with its careful documentation and deliberate concealment, was part of something larger, something his grandfather had intended him to understand in due time. Yet it was also clear that what he had found so far was only the beginning. He decided to return downstairs before the day slipped away entirely. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards, and the forest beyond the windows had taken on the muted colors of early evening. He lifted the rug again, the movement now practiced, and opened the hatch with a familiarity that felt strange considering he had only just learned of its existence. Descending into the cool, dry air, he switched on the flashlight and made his way back into the stone chamber. This time, he walked with greater purpose. He knew exactly where he wanted to look, the lower shelves along the wall opposite the stairs. There had been several small boxes there, each one unmarked, their lids closed as though hiding something more personal than the cataloged items on display elsewhere. Kneeling down, he pulled one of the boxes toward him, brushing away a fine layer of dust before opening it. Inside was a stack of envelopes, some sealed, others yellowed and worn from age. His breath caught when he saw the topmost envelope. In neat, deliberate handwriting, his name was written across the front. For Michael. The sight alone was enough to still his movements. He reached out and lifted the envelope carefully, as though it might crumble if handled too roughly. The paper was thick and high quality, the kind rarely used anymore, and the ink of his name had barely faded. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, the air around him feeling heavier, as though the walls of the room were leaning in, urging him to open it. When he did, the flap came free with little resistance. Inside was a folded sheet of stationery, the same type his grandfather had always kept in the desk upstairs. Michael unfolded it slowly, and there, in the familiar Lupin script, was the voice of the man he had buried only days before. "Michael," it began, "if you are reading this, it means you have found the room, and that I was right to leave it in your hands. You know me well enough to understand that I do not give trust lightly. I have spent much of my life building and preserving what you now see here. To others, these may appear to be objects of material value. To me, they are pieces of history, each one carrying a story worth protecting. And I have come to believe that you are the only one among us who will understand this and keep it safe." Michael's eyes moved slowly over the lines, each word pulling him deeper into the meaning behind them. His grandfather wrote of the temptations that money and possessions could bring, of how quickly the rest of the family might strip this collection bare for quick profit. He wrote of conversations he had had with Michael over the years, talks about honor, patience, and the importance of knowing the worth of something beyond its price tag. He recalled the small moments Michael had half forgotten, the day they repaired the old fence in the rain, when Michael had insisted on finishing the job properly rather than taking a shortcut. The time he had chosen to return a lost wallet rather than keep the cash inside. These things, the letter continued, told me all I needed to know about your character. You may not think much of them now, but they spoke louder than any promises could. That is why I've left this to you, not to burden you, but to entrust you with something that will outlast both of us if you care for it as I have. Michael felt a tightening in his chest as he read. The letter was more than a set of instructions. It was a confirmation of something he had long suspected, but never fully allowed himself to believe. His grandfather had seen him, truly seen him, in ways others in the family never had. The words carried a weight of approval that no amount of inheritance could match. Near the end of the letter, there was a line that caught his attention in a different way. When the time is right, there is another place you must find. It holds the rest of the story. I've left signs for you here, if you look closely. The words sent a small current of anticipation through him. Another place? Another secret beyond this already hidden trove? He scanned the rest of the page, but there were no further clues, just his grandfather's signature, firm and steady as though written yesterday. Folding the letter carefully, Michael placed it back in the envelope and returned it to the box, though he kept his hand on it for a moment longer before letting go. He rose to his feet, the flashlight beam sweeping over the shelves once more, this time with a sharper eye. The suggestion of signs lingered in his mind. Could it be something as simple as a mark on the wall, or was it hidden among the countless items in the room? For now, he decided he would not rush. His grandfather's tone in the letter had been deliberate, almost cautionary, as if to remind him that discovery was best approached with patience. There would be time to search more thoroughly, but tonight he would let the significance of the letter settle in. The truth was, finding it had already changed something in him. The cabin, the collection, the sealed chamber beneath the floor, all of it now carried a more personal weight. This was not just a matter of inheritance, it was a legacy deliberately placed in his keeping. When he returned to the main room above, he closed the hatch with even greater care than before, drawing the rug neatly over it. The letter stayed with him, resting in the breast pocket of his shirt as he moved about the cabin. He made himself a simple dinner from the provisions he had brought, the firelight casting a warm glow over the walls. Between bites, he found himself glancing toward the spot where the rug lay, as though the hatch might somehow open on its own if left unattended. Later, as the fire burned down and the night air cooled, Michael sat by the hearth reading the letter again. He studied every line, every turn of phrase, searching for hints of where the next place might be. Though nothing obvious revealed itself, he felt certain that when the moment came, he would know. His grandfather had trusted him enough to believe he would find it, and Michael would not let that trust be misplaced. As the last embers dimmed, he placed the letter in the desk drawer upstairs, tucking it between the pages of the leather-bound book for safekeeping. The knowledge of its presence there, quietly waiting, was like a compass pointing toward a path he could not yet see, but knew he was meant to walk. Outside, the forest was silent, holding its own secrets in the darkness. Inside, Michael lay awake longer than usual, the image of his grandfather's handwriting fixed in his mind, the weight of the letter's message settling firmly into place. He understood now that the cabin was not an end but a beginning, and that his role as a keeper of its secrets had only just begun. The morning after he read the letter, Michael woke with the distinct feeling that something had shifted. The cabin seemed different in the pale light that filtered through the windows. It wasn't the building itself. Its wooden walls were as weathered as before, the floors as creaky, but rather the way he now saw it. Everything inside felt tied to the letter folded between the pages of the ledger downstairs, as though the words his grandfather had left him had rewoven the threads of the place. The cabin was no longer just a remote inheritance. It was a trust, an appointment, and, in a way, a challenge. He made coffee in the enamel pot, savoring the bitter steam as it rose, and stood by the window looking out toward the forest. He had barely begun to form the day's plans, whether to search the hidden room again for clues about the other place or to spend time cleaning the overgrown yard, when his phone, lying face down on the table, began to buzz. It was a number he recognized instantly, though he hadn't heard from its owner in years, his Aunt Vivian. "Michael, dear," she began, her voice smooth and measured, the kind of tone she used when she wanted something. "I was just thinking about you up there in that old cabin. How's it treating you?" He could hear the faint edge in her words, a practiced casualness that never reached sincerity. He answered simply, telling her it was fine, that he was settling in. After a few pleasantries, the real purpose of her call emerged. "You know, your grandfather had quite a few valuable things over the years. We were all surprised he didn't leave them to be shared equally. I suppose, well, perhaps you found a few things there that could benefit the whole family?" The pause that followed was deliberate, heavy with expectation. Michael let it stretch before replying that he hadn't found anything meant for anyone else, which was the truth as he understood it. The silence on the other end was telling. By the afternoon, 2 more calls had come, one from his cousin Bradley, whose tone was less polite, and one from his Uncle Roy, who didn't bother with pretense at all. Roy's voice was gruff, tinged with irritation. "I hear there's more in that cabin than just dust and mouse droppings. Don't be a fool, Mike. If there's anything worth money, you ought to think about selling and splitting it. That's the decent thing to do." Michael answered with the same calm refusal, though inside he could feel a slow burn building. It wasn't the pressure itself that bothered him, but the swiftness with which they all assumed his responsibility could be turned into their gain. That evening, as the firelight painted the cabin's interior in warm hues, he thought about the letter again. His grandfather had known this would happen. The lines about greed, about the quickness with which they'd strip away history for profit, now felt prophetic. And knowing this, Michael began to feel less troubled by their demands and more resolved to guard what he'd been entrusted with. 2 days later, the pressure moved from the phone to his doorstep. He was out in the yard, cutting back a tangle of vines that had swallowed part of the porch railing, when a familiar voice called from the tree line. Bradley emerged from the path, dressed in expensive hiking boots that looked like they'd never touched actual dirt before, carrying a paper bag from a local bakery as if it were a peace offering. "Thought I'd bring you something," he said with an easy grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Michael accepted the bag. Inside were 2 cinnamon rolls, but the gesture was transparent. Bradley wasted little time before leaning against the porch post and steering the conversation toward the cabin's interior. "You been down in the cellar? These old places sometimes have wine cellars, or safes. I mean, if you found anything interesting, we could, work something out." Michael met his gaze evenly, saying only that he had everything in order and didn't need any help. Bradley's smile flickered, the silence between them tightening, and within minutes he was making his way back down the path. Watching him go, Michael felt the weight of his grandfather's trust more keenly than ever. The calls and visits continued over the next week. Some relatives tried charm, others used guilt, and a few hinted at legal action, suggesting that the will's wording could be interpreted differently if it came to that. But Michael remained steady, each attempt only reinforcing the quiet certainty that this collection, this cabin, had been meant for him and him alone. He thought often of the afternoons he had spent with his grandfather in years past, of Henry's measured way of doing things, his insistence on seeing a job through properly, his ability to say no without ever raising his voice. One night, after a particularly strained call from Aunt Vivian, who accused him of hoarding family history, Michael sat at the desk in the cabin's main room and opened the ledger. The lamplight pooled across the pages, illuminating the careful handwriting. His eyes wandered from entry to entry, absorbing the details not just as records, but as fragments of a larger story, a story the others would never care to read. They would see only the price tags. The sense of isolation grew, but it was not unpleasant. The cabin became a fortress in more ways than one. He kept the hatch locked at all times now, even when he was inside, and began making small improvements to the main room, oiling the hinges on the front door, tightening the loose boards in the floor, clearing the weeds from the yard. Each task grounded him, reminded him that the place was his to care for, not to surrender. One morning, while hauling debris to a pile near the edge of the property, he noticed a narrow trail leading into the woods, overgrown but visible if you knew where to look. It wasn't on the side where the relatives arrived, and he realized they had probably never noticed it. Something about the path stirred a thought from the letter. Another place, and signs left for him. He didn't act on it immediately, but the idea settled in his mind like a seed, quietly taking root. As autumn deepened, the visits became less frequent, though the occasional call still came through. Michael no longer felt the sting of their accusations. If anything, the noise had faded, leaving behind a clearer sense of purpose. He understood now that protecting what his grandfather had left him was not just about keeping the collection safe. It was about preserving the spirit in which it had been gathered, and that meant standing firm, no matter who knocked on his door or what they demanded. By the time the first frost coated the grass around the cabin, Michael had settled into a rhythm. He rose with the light, worked on the property, and spent the evenings in the quiet glow of the fire, sometimes poring over the ledger, sometimes simply listening to the forest outside. The family's interest had not disappeared entirely, but it had dulled, replaced by a wary respect or perhaps just resignation. Either way, it gave him the space he needed. And now, with their distractions fading into the distance, he could turn his attention to that overgrown trail and the possibility that it led somewhere his grandfather had wanted him to find. The time for patience, he felt, was drawing to an end. Soon he would follow it. The first frost lingered in thin silver lines along the porch railings when Michael woke that morning. Outside, the air had the sharp, invigorating scent of the season's change, carrying with it the faint aroma of damp earth and pine. He pulled on his coat and stepped out into the clearing, his breath forming small clouds in the cold. The cabin stood quiet behind him, its roof glistening faintly with frost, and the surrounding forest seemed to be holding its breath. It had been several days since the last call from a family member, and in their absence the stillness had deepened. The quiet was no longer an empty thing. It was something that belonged to the cabin, something that belonged to him. His eyes turned almost immediately toward the trail he had noticed before, the faint narrow line where the grass grew thinner and the leaves lay disturbed. The path led into the trees beyond the yard, partly hidden by low branches, and now, with no one to interrupt, he felt it was time to see where it went. The letter's words came back to him, about another place and signs left for him. He fetched his gloves, a small satchel, and the flashlight, though the morning sun was bright enough for now. The trail began easily, the earth firm underfoot, though the foliage had crept in from both sides. A thin crust of frost covered the fallen leaves, crunching softly with each step. The air grew cooler as he moved deeper into the woods, and the sounds of the clearing faded until all that remained was the quiet rush of the wind through the treetops. He followed the path as it twisted around a stand of tall pines, dipped slightly, then rose toward a ridge where the light filtered in golden and warm. It was there, at the top of the rise, that he saw the old structure. From a distance, it looked like a shed, its walls made of weathered planks turned gray by the years. The roof sagged in places, but it still held together, and the door, though slightly crooked, was closed and secured by a simple latch. The ground around it was uneven, dotted with patches of moss and fallen branches, but the air here had that same dry, preserved scent as the hidden room beneath the cabin. Michael approached slowly, running his hand along the rough wood of the wall. The grain caught against his gloves, and he felt the faint ridges where the nails had been driven in decades ago. He lifted the latch and pushed the door inward. The hinges gave a low groan, but the door moved easily enough, swinging open to reveal a dim interior. Inside, the light filtered through narrow gaps between the boards, casting thin beams across the dusty air. The shed was empty at first glance, save for a few crates pushed against the far wall and a workbench cluttered with tools. But as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something odd about the floor near the back, a section of planks that looked newer, less worn than the rest. He stepped closer, knelt, and ran his fingers over the boards. The seams were tight, but there was a faint outline, rectangular and deliberate. The boards lifted with a bit of effort, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. Inside lay a single wooden chest, small enough to carry but heavy enough to suggest it held something significant. The chest was plain but well made, the wood dark and smooth, the corners reinforced with tarnished brass. A small brass key protruded from the lock, as though it had been waiting for him. He turned the key, hearing the satisfying click of the mechanism, and lifted the lid. The hinges moved smoothly, and the chest opened to reveal its contents, a collection of personal items wrapped in soft cloth, things that were clearly meant for him, not for display or sale. On top lay another envelope with his name, the same careful handwriting as before. Beneath it were photographs, some he recognized from the cabin's mantel, and others he had never seen. There was Henry, as a boy, standing beside a much older man, Michael's great-grandfather, both of them in front of a structure that might have been the cabin in its earliest days. Another photo showed Henry in his middle years, standing in front of the very shed where Michael now sat. He opened the envelope and began to read. The letter was shorter than the first, but its words carried the same steady weight. "Michael," it began, "by now you will have seen enough to understand why I chose you. The room beneath the cabin holds what I gathered over the course of my life, But this place holds the roots of it all. These photographs, these few keepsakes, are pieces of our family's beginning here. My father built the cabin with his own hands. My mother kept the first ledger you will find in the chest. I have added to it, but it is not finished. That will be your work now, if you choose to take it on." He read slowly, letting each sentence sink in. The letter spoke of the land itself, of how it had been bought with the first wages his great-grandfather earned after arriving in the area, and how every improvement, every nail and board had been placed by the family. It spoke of the choice to keep the property intact, even when money was tight, because it was more than just land. It was a place where their history was rooted. At the bottom of the chest, beneath the photographs and the ledger, Michael found a small velvet pouch. Inside were a few coins, different from those in the underground collection. These were worn smooth, their details faded by countless years of handling. He held one between his fingers, imagining the hands that had passed it down. They weren't worth much in currency, but in meaning, they were priceless. He sat in the shed for a long time, the open chest before him, the letter resting in his lap. The quiet here was deeper than in the cabin, and it felt as though the air itself was holding the voices of those who had come before. He thought of the calls from his relatives, their sharp questions and thinly veiled demands, and realized how far removed they were from this place, not just in distance but in spirit. They would never walk this trail, never open this chest and feel what he was feeling now. When he finally stood, he closed the chest carefully and returned the boards to their place, fitting them snugly so they would remain hidden. He secured the shed's door before stepping back out into the bright afternoon. The path back to the cabin felt different this time. Each bend, each patch of frost-covered leaves seemed to carry a weight of connection, as though he were walking not just on forest ground but on the fabric of his family's history. Back at the cabin, he placed the letter from the shed alongside the first one in the ledger. The chest's contents he stored in the underground room, giving them a place among the other treasures. Then he stood in the center of the cabin and looked around, the late sunlight spilling in through the windows. The air inside felt warmer, fuller, as though the walls themselves recognized what he had brought back. In the days that followed, Michael continued his work on the property. He repaired the sagging porch steps, cleared the brush from around the cabin, and stacked fresh wood by the fireplace. Each task felt less like upkeep and more like tending to something alive. He knew now that his role was not merely to hold on to these things, but to live with them, to preserve them in the spirit they had been given. On one particularly clear evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, he took the ledger from its place and began to write. He recorded the day he found the shed, the contents of the chest, and the feelings that had come with the discovery. His handwriting was slower than his grandfather's, but steady, and with each line he felt himself settling more fully into the role he had been given. When he finally closed the book and set it on the table, the room seemed to breathe with him. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the faint, clean scent of winter on its way. Michael leaned back in his chair, his gaze drawn to the rug that concealed the hatch. Beneath it lay history. Beyond the trees lay the beginnings of that history. And here, in this cabin, in this moment, lay the man now charged with guarding it. It was not a burden. It was not even an obligation. It was, simply, his legacy. And he would see to it that it endured. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. Watch our upcoming stories and explore other videos on the channel. Share this video with friends so they can enjoy it too.